Jesus, the name that shouts our fears, that bids our sorrows cease. 'Tis music in the sinner's ears, 'tis life and health and peace. He breaks the power of cancelled sin, he sets the prisoner free. His blood can make the foulest clean, his blood avail for me. My gracious Master and my God, assist me to proclaim, to spread through all the earth abroad the honors of thy name.
The fourth chapter, the last of 4 chapters of this book of Ruth. In the first chapter of this great Old Testament book, we meet Naomi, defeated and bitter after a series of tragedies that had left her literally poor and defenseless. Her husband and sons had died, and now as she returned home to Bethlehem, all she had left was her daughter-in-law Ruth, a foreigner from Moab. In the second chapter, Ruth finds success gleaning in the fields. The older man who owns the field just turns out to be a relative of Naomi's, and therefore is a potential kinsman redeemer, someone who could provide financial security for these 2 widows, and someone who, with Ruth, could father a son to carry on Naomi's family line. Last week, we looked at chapter 3 and a series of private conversations in which one person after another took the initiative. That began with Naomi explaining her plan to Ruth, and then Ruth meets Boaz on the threshing floor in the middle of the night and boldly asks him to be their kinsman redeemer. And translated into modern English, that means, "Will you marry me?" He immediately says yes, but points out a problem. There's a closer relative who has priority. But he assures her that he will look after it. So as we've looked at these 3 chapters, we've noticed several important words from God. First, this is a powerful example, this story, of how God's help comes to us even when things are seemingly at their worst. When the situation is just completely dreary. When, as Ruth was there at the verge of entering her old hometown of Bethlehem, she complains to God and says, "God, things used to be so good. I had a husband and sons, and everything was great." She was looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, I'm afraid, but it was better for sure. And now she says, "God sent me out full from Bethlehem, but brought me back empty." She didn't even think about Ruth standing loyally beside her. The narrator of the story makes the subtle but important point that it was just as barley harvest was beginning when they arrived, and the fruitfulness of the fields are kind of a foreshadowing of the blessing that Ruth and Naomi are going to receive. And so many times, I think, when we're down in the dumps, when we're depressed and discouraged about how life goes, we think everything is lost. We think it's completely sad and troubling, just useless and discouraging. And we don't realize that God has already started to rebuild our life, to give us blessings, that there's someone beside us like Ruth who can help, that there's a community in Bethlehem who will get together and be a support, that there are ones waiting in the wings of God's great drama to make a difference in our lives. Secondly, I think we've learned already that God's providential care follows us all the time. And as it turns out, that's the phrase that we looked at in chapter 2, every detail of our life is part of God's complete plan. It might be complicated, it might need some serious explanation and interpretation, but especially when we look back on things, we realize that even though others were mean to us, even though they meant it for bad, God was working in it for good. Even the worst failures of our lives, it seems, God has used to make a significant, important difference in our lives. And God is doing that by constantly being involved in the backstories and the background of our life. In the things that we sometimes say, oh, it just turned out that. God was working in that too. And thirdly, last week we realized over again, I think, as we studied this story, that you and I need a redeemer. Not only did Ruth and Naomi need a redeemer who would rescue their lives from economic ruin, but you and I need a redeemer to rescue us from the various kinds of ruins that we sit among, the various kinds of ruin that our life has become. We need someone like Jesus Christ who would take the initiative while we were yet sinners, while we were still his enemies, who would step into our world and our life and say, here's a redeemer for you. Here's someone who can make it better, who can pick up the broken pieces, who can provide the healing and the ongoing support that you need, who can rescue you from sin and guilt and shame and death, who can undo the shackles, who can make it better and new. Jesus became one of us. He was like a kinsman redeemer. He became a relative in our house to rescue us from the slavery of sin and the sentence of death that hung over us. And perhaps there, more than any other place in the book of Ruth, we're challenged to trust in Jesus. To say, yes, God, I accept your wonderful gift of a redeemer. Well, now in the last chapter of Ruth, events move quickly. Boaz meets the nearer relative at the town gate and asks him to sit down for an important meeting. He collects the required witnesses for a legal transaction, and then he presents the situation to this man who's not even given a name. Naomi has come back from Moab, Boaz explains. She's selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative, whatever his name was. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention, and I suggest that you buy it so that the land can be kept in the family. If you will redeem it, go ahead and buy it back. But if you won't, tell me, because I'm the next of kin. I'm the next in line, actually, after you. Okay, the man says, I'll redeem it. Well then, Boaz replied, there's just one other thing you need to know before we get really serious about this. On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the foreigner, the dead man's widow, and with her the responsibility to father her son in order to keep his property in the family. Well, that complicates things, doesn't it? That makes this whole proposal a much more complicated thing. And while you ponder that complicated story, let me tell the others another almost just somewhat related story. The manager of a megastore came to check on his new salesman. How many customers did you serve today? The manager says. 1, says the salesman. 1, said the boss. How much was the sale? The salesman answered, $78,334. Flabbergasted, the manager asked him to explain. Well, first I sold the man a fish hook, the salesman said, and then I sold him a rod and a reel. And then I asked where he was planning to fish, and he said, down by the coast. And I said, you'll probably need a boat for that. And I sold him that 20-foot runabout. And then when he said his Volkswagen might not be able to pull it, I took him over to the automotive department and sold him a big SUV. The amazed boss asked him, you sold all that to a guy who came in and asked for a fishhook? No, the new salesman replied. He actually came in for a bottle of aspirin for his wife's migraine, and I told him, your weekend's shot. You should go fishing. Life is complicated. Life has layer upon layer of reality that sometimes gets very confusing to sort out. And that near Redeemer who was prepared to redeem the land because he saw a financial benefit for himself, a one-time only transaction it was a one-time only transaction that would give Naomi money in the bank. But Ruth is a new fact that he hadn't counted on, a level of complexity in the story that he didn't see coming. If he agreed to that, he would have to support her on an ongoing basis, as well as her children. And then when they came of age, they would receive the land back from the kinsman redeemer. It was a losing proposition for this relatively uninterested relative. He was willing to be responsible, to do his duty, even if it meant some inconvenience or a small drain on his assets. But he wasn't prepared to make a substantial sacrifice for the lives, for the good of others. And maybe, said somebody who I read late last night as I was brushing up on this, maybe that's the reason this potential kinsman redeemer, this nearer relative, doesn't even get his name mentioned in the Bible, because ends up being the one who wears ignominy on his head, who doesn't look very good at the end of it. The man says, I cannot redeem it. I'm sorry. I can't redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. I could go poor supporting all this new family. You redeem it yourself, he says. I can't. Go ahead and buy it yourself, he repeats. And so with the wave of a sandal in the presence of witnesses, it's even easier than just tapping your Visa card. The matter was officially decided. Boaz would marry Ruth and be a kinsman redeemer for her and Naomi, and everything would be well. All things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose, says the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 8. And then we say, wait. I mean, the story has ended up beautifully. The love story has just coming to a wonderful conclusion. But there's no baby yet. How can the long-term good of this family be a reality if there's no one to carry on the family name? In those days, continuing security depended on a thriving family. And as yet, Naomi doesn't have any chance of having an extended family. That depended on the birth of a child to Ruth, who would carry on Elimelech's family name. Listen carefully to the prayers of those witnesses at the gate just before they leave. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home, Boaz, be like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. What they didn't say was that Rachel had been childless for years before finally giving birth, just as Ruth apparently had been childless for about 10 years in her marriage to Naomi's son, Kilian. A little bit later, those witnesses at the gate say, through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Yes, Ruth was a younger woman, and Boaz was not so young anymore. And would they really have a child together? As many childless couples can testify, it's not automatic. Conception might come naturally, but it doesn't come automatically. But in their case, for the sake of the story and for the sake of the reason the story is told, as you'll see at the very end, the suspense doesn't last long. Chapter 4, verse 13 of the book of Ruth tells us that Boaz married Ruth. They made love. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. In one short verse, the story is resolved. God comes through. His care for his people is shown. Ellen Davis, an Old Testament commentator, says, a providential event, this birth, is the blessed result of both extraordinary human actions that we've been reading about in the whole book already, and the result of the common but never less than miraculous action of God in making the womb fruitful. It's always a combination of things, isn't it? Of human actions and God's gift. And so a baby has been born. A son has been given. And this historical short story is over. Except that it's not quite. There's one more twist in the tale. As we come to the end of the book of Ruth, the author mentions each of the main players one more time, starting in verse 14. The first word gives God the credit. The Lord hasn't been mentioned a lot in this book, but he's the one, as we've noticed, who's been constantly working behind the scenes. Unless the Lord builds the house, says Psalm 127, all our actions are for nothing. So praise be to the Lord, say the women at the gate, because he has visited and redeemed his people. God gets the credit here. God has done the glorious work. The second word of appreciation goes to Boaz, this guardian redeemer or kinsman redeemer. He was also praised back in verse 11 when the witnesses at the gate say, may you have standing in Bethlehem and in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. He consistently showed the loving kindness that is God's own nature. While others were prepared to be kind and responsible, Boaz looked for ways to excel in everything. When others were prepared to do only what was in their own self-interests, Boaz had the hesed, the loving kindness of God that would excel in everything. And so we add our voice to the chorus. A praiseworthy man indeed is Boaz. And then third, in verse 15, there is Ruth, Naomi's daughter-in-law. The women point out what we noticed right from the very first time that she came on the scene. Ruth loves her mother-in-law and is better to her than 7 sons. That's, by the way, the first time the word love shows up in this famous story, a story that's used at weddings over and over again to celebrate the long-lasting love of a husband to a wife and a wife to a husband. Ruth, though, loves her mother-in-law, has had her best interests at heart right from the beginning. She was the one who declared her faith in God, Naomi's God, and her loyalty to Naomi. I'll follow you and help you. That's high praise. In a narrative that has concentrated on telling the story of a son, the interrelational highlight is this close love between Ruth and Naomi. The fourth person mentioned here is the newborn baby, who is called Obed. We see him there in Naomi's lap. This baby gave Naomi, who had so bitterly declared her feelings of emptiness, a new lease on life. She came back empty to Bethlehem, but now her lap was full. In her case, the bumper sticker was true. If I had known that being a grandparent could be so much fun, I'd have done it first. But of course, Obed is not so important for his own sake, but as it turns out, because of his descendants. You see, Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David, King David, the greatest king that Israel ever had, the man after God's own heart, under whom the people of Israel became the most successful that they had ever been. In fact, it was David who is the high point of the Old Testament. David, who is the first person in this story who is famous. Up till now, it's been the story of ordinary Joes and Janes with names that we had never heard of before. And even though Ruth is a name that most Christians know pretty well, it was all new to the readers of this story. David, the great king of Israel, is the end product of Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's determination to do the right thing, of Naomi's scheming even, of God's working behind the scenes. God has drawn into Israel's group, to Israel's genealogy, and to the background, the ancestors of David, the great king, at a key moment, just a couple of generations before, a foreigner from Moab. And so this book ends literally with the name of David. Ruth was King David's great-grandmother. And so this story, therefore, it says, Eugene Peterson, is not an isolated romantic anecdote, but a key chapter in the history of salvation. And then, of course, when we step back from Ruth and look at the whole Bible in our hands, we begin in Matthew chapter 1 and read the long genealogy that includes Ruth and ends with Jesus. And this little story becomes even more important to us because the hero, Ruth, was also an ancestor of our Savior, our kinsman redeemer, Jesus.